So let's dive into our unit on federalism and talk about some of the flashcards for basically the second part of Unit 1 according to the College Board curriculum. And this covers the relationship between the states and the federal government, which is what federalism is. So our first flashcard really talks about some basic concepts and terminology. We need to know specifically that we have national powers, concurrent powers, and state powers. And one of the key things to understand here is just some of the terminology and how these terms are described. So national powers are often also described as powers that are enumerated in the Constitution or as powers that are expressed in the Constitution. So be clear that those mean the same things. And concurrent powers are powers that are shared. And then often state powers are also referred to as reserve powers, and that's a term that's derived from the 10th Amendment, which says that powers not given to the state governments are reserved to the states. The powers not given to the national governments are reserved to the states. So a few examples of national powers that the states don't share with them. Obviously, the power to declare war, the power to establish a national post office, the power to regulate commerce between states is a clear national power, the power to establish national courts. Although the power to establish courts just in and of themselves is a concurrent power. Both the states and the federal government have their own court system. They both can tax, and states, on the other hand, have the reserved police powers. They can also run elections, which is something that is a state power. The national government doesn't run an election. So those are some examples. There's a Venn diagram on some of my materials on Canvas. And certainly I'm sure you can find a diagram of this in your textbook and be able to understand and recognize which powers are which. So there's some concepts that really do impact the relationship between state and federal governments. And we can talk about a few different concepts. For example, on this next flashcard, we talk about categorical grants and block grants. So one of the things that is a big part of the relationship between state and federal governments is finances and money. And oftentimes money is something that trickles from the federal government to the state governments. When money is granted or given to state governments in a categorical grant, then these grants have specific guidelines attached, and there are usually requirements on where that money needs to be spent. However, a block grant, which became more prominent and popular in the late 20th century under most notably the presidency of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, these restrictions were removed or are removed, and there's usually more large chunks of money to be used for broad purposes rather than specific purposes. So block grants give more power to the state governments because it gives them the authority to spend money. Categorical grants gives more power to the federal government because it really gives the federal government the authority to designate what that money is going to be spent on. So grants have a big part of the relationship between state and federal governments, and so too do mandates have a major part of the relationship between state and federal government. So the federal government can impose restrictions or requirements, is probably a better way to describe it, upon states. And oftentimes there's debates about whether or not these mandates, for example, retrofitting buildings to be handicapped accessible or meeting certain benchmarks for education testing. There's oftentimes debates over whether or not the federal government should be imposing mandates without providing funding. And sometimes these unfunded mandates can be very controversial. So the federal government can and does impose required actions upon the states in the form of mandates. A few other terms or terminology. I apologize for this being cut up here, but again, if we talk about how state programs and federal programs are related to one another, it's just good to talk about some of the language we use. So a federal aid program would be when the federal government is providing direct aid to states for specific programs that they have in place. A federal incentive is when the federal government will use finances or money to try to basically use kind of a carrot approach to incentivize state behavior. So if you, for example, come up with a innovative education program, then you can get federal dollars to help implement it. And then there's revenue sharing. A good example of this would be something like the gas tax, which there's a federal tax on every gallon of gas that's sold, and then that money is dispersed amongst the states for highway projects. And so money is shared amongst the states by the federal government. So this kind of gives us an opening to some of the key relationships and concepts and vocabulary when it comes to the relationships between the state and federal government. So there's a good place to pause.